Cool. With that in mind, it's weird because I'm always like, did I press record? But fortunately, if they're in chat and they say they hear you, then Twitch has done everything for me. I can't screw this up. So with that in mind, I tell you what, introduce yourself and kind of let us know who you are and what you've been doing for the last seems like
Mhm.
forever in games. And
Long time.
yeah,
Hey everybody, I'm Geoffrey Zatkin. I'm a video game designer and have been at this point for almost 25 years professionally. I was one of the original designers on EverQuest. I think I was person 7 or 8-ish on the team. I am by heart a systems designer, but over the years I've worked on EverQuest, EverQuest 2, Sovereign. I was poached actually from Sony Online by Monolith Productions to go work on a DC Comics game and assist the team making The Matrix Online. In '06, I started a research firm with a buddy, Greg Short, who used to run a website called Caster's Realm, which is where I met him. And we formed a market research firm called EDAR, which I ran with him for about a decade. We became the biggest video game market research firm around. Sold that in 15-ish. Um, Started up a new studio, Experiment 7. We're doing VR games. We did a D&D license. We did the official Settlers of Catan license for VR. And I also am the studio director. Well, besides being co-owner of Experiment 7, I'm the studio director of a YouTube channel called Extra Credits that puts out animated videos on game design, history, and mythology. And been doing that for a couple years. So I have a habit of hopping into interesting things and helping figure out how to make them work. And
yeah,
anything you want to talk about for that, we can talk more. But that's the short version.
absolutely. Yeah, no, and it's funny because starting with EQ, it is interesting thing after interesting thing. So, um, yeah, we spend a lot of time either playing EverQuest or watching, you know, playing EverQuest, playing on P99 now, having people come in that are guests to talk about the EQ days, etc. So very EQ focused, and folks have been asking me to try to get people that were a part of the team and a part of like the EQ journey before I got there because I didn't start until 2000 and I was in customer service and then worked my way onto the team during Shadows of Lucklin. And so everything
Yeah.
before that's a mystery. So
So we just missed because I was on from I think in '97. So core game and then Kunark and then yeah, getting a little bit into Velius um, before I split off to help on EQ2 and on Sovereign.
right.
So yeah, you and I literally just did ships in the night passing on that then.
Yeah, and I'd see you around, especially it's weird because I don't remember seeing you as much during maybe your time on EQ2
I helped
compared
out with
to
some of the very
Sovereign.
early stuff, but yeah, Smed. I used to play. We used to play Age of Empires at the office after hours, and I used to kick Smed and Brad's butt on that. And so when we were working on Sovereign for the strategy game, at a certain point, he just came over and said, "Hey, you want to be the lead designer of this?" And they'd been working for I think a year or two with no designer on the project. It was
Right.
all tech, and I was like, "Sure." And we went for a wild ride on that because it was a year or two of tech with no design.
Hmm.
And so they had some really cool tech, but it was not a game. And but that's its own whole story. So that's why I was working initially on EQ2, but got offered an interesting position to move out of that.
Right on. How did you wind up on EQ in the first place?
Let's see. So I've been playing games for a very long time and making them. My dad brought home an Apple IIe when I was very young. I taught myself to program some basic, and I was playing anything I could get my hands on, and D&D basic set, and then first edition, Car Wars, and BattleTech, and Shadowrun, and Cyberpunk. All of those kind of games.
Mm.
And in junior high and high school, I started playing BBS games, which were online games,
Hmm.
dialing in with a modem. And then in college, I started programming MUDs or playing MUDs and then programming MUDs, which were text based like 30 to 4 player games or 30 to 40 to 50 player games. And I was again, I had no coding formal training background. I actually have a psychology degree and a liberal arts background, but like most game designers, I just learned a whole bunch of different things along the way. And right out of college, I ended up actually working for an internet startup, providing internet access. And about a year in, I was like, I'm tired of this. I'd still been making games on the side. And I saw a Usenet News ad post by Brad McQuaid saying, looking for people who can program LPC C++, which was a MUD programming language, and who can design 3D levels. And I'd been doing mods of Marathon, which was Bungie's
Mm-hmm.
game pre
Yeah.
Halo. And so I wrote back and said, I think I'm exactly who you're looking for. And so I came into the office. I brought my Mac with me because I was a Mac boy then. And they played through some of my marathon levels and checked out some of my mud code. And I was hired a week later. Um, as somebody, I had no game design background, but there were no game schools then. It's
Yeah.
just I'd been doing this for years and years and years as a hobby. And so I was hired initially as a level designer. And I made Guck was my first Guck upper and lower were my first two dungeons. And then I made Akanon, and then I transferred to be a system designer, which was they had a good amount of level designers, but not a lot of people for the nuts and bolts. And so I then went and did the magic system, worked on combat, the economy, treasure, balance, monster population, treasure table, all of kind of the good crunchy systems.
Mm.
Ryan Palacio was one of the other designers. He and I, like, I'd do initial population of a zone, and then he'd go through and do the fine tuning of it. But I'd set up all of the, I'd go make the monster templates and make the monsters and some basic items and some treasure tables. And I could have spent more time balancing, but it was a really good 1-2 team because I'd do the the quick get the zone up and running, and then he'd go through and he'd take a lot of time tuning it while I then got all of the rest of the zone up and running. But that and the magic system was my big one. I spent a lot of time because 11 of the 14 classes had magic. And so I launched with 750 spells that I put into the database, um, and was working with Roger Uzin, who was doing our AI, and Steve Clover, who was doing the tools for like the spells, and learned some. We were using what was it, Microsoft Access,
Uh-huh. Yep.
um, the database work, and yeah, I knew nothing about databases before that, but again, I'd sit down and figure it out because that was kind of what we all did.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was the same. When I first saw the database, I was like, I'm never going to figure this out. I was shown at like 2 in the morning by Jeremy Ellis, like, all right, this is our tool. I'm like, oh no. Oh
Yeah,
no. I'm not gonna get a job. And then,
it was funny too because we didn't actually have a database programmer for the design team. Ryan Palacio knew a little bit of it, so he was like doing a little bit of front end for it, but it was just the team was so small on launch.
mm,
I think there were 23 members of the dev team that put out the game at launch. That's just that's a tiny team for the amount of stuff we made.
yeah.
So we were all just learning things as we went along.
No, it's crazy. I mean, you just mentioned, I mean, so when you say you did Gawk upper and lower, did you do the like level design, or did you actually create the level art?
So let's see. Actually, it was initially just going to be Guck, but I made such a big dungeon that we ended up having to split it into two pieces because we just couldn't run it.
Right.
Um, so Bill Troust, who is the lead designer, had initially envisioned Guck, and he gave me a map that had like 4 rooms in it, I think, and one or two sketches of a couple of concept art sketches.
Mm.
Um, and it was basically, here you go to it. And so I hopped into our level design tool and just made those pieces and then just kept building the dungeon. And so like the initial part of Guck he had was the tunnel leading in with the tiny side,
Hmm.
kind of um the water with the walkway kind of rising out of it. There was a waterfall, there's a room up, I think to the left that we had a shaman caster in, and then something that kind of looked like the water was flowing downriver. And that was it. And so I took that and ran and probably turned it into what, like a 50 room ish dungeon. But everything else I just started building. But I'd been playing D&D at that point for, I was like 22, so I've been playing D&D for over a decade, running games. I knew how to make good dungeons. And so
You
I
absolutely
started,
did.
and I very much approached, I was probably one of the people there who had played the most D&D. And like even in college, I was president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Guild. Like I was the one putting together our conventions to run and running campaigns and other things. Same for like my high school friends, where for the summers, if we didn't have jobs, we were over at my house like 3 days a week playing through campaigns that I would build. So I had a lot of like, I had thousands of hours playing D&D kinds of games. And so I just started building dungeons. And the same thing. Then like I then got to go through and populate them.
Mm,
And then Bill Troust came back. He was also an artist. He went and then did all of the textures for it. So I built all the geometry and he gave me textures to put on the geometry, um, or skinned them. And then if we needed more, I'd go back and say, hey, we need a so and so kind of texture. So he had the initial concept art and he was the one who did the visual texture work, but I did all of the building and then past the first couple rooms, just all of the here's the kind of things we're going to make.
right on. Did you spend a fair amount of time like in graph paper or sketching it out, or was it one of those things where you got in the editor and you just kind of flowed with it and freestyled?
Um, for that one, it was more freestyle, because I kind of knew what I wanted to make. Trying to remember how much I sketched out beforehand. Some of it honestly was what was I feeling out feeling like during that day? You know, did I want to go make a, weird series of tunnels or a big room where there's a couple of encounters, the underwater trip through, it was just being creative. And it was also my first use of the Sony
Mm.
level editor. So it was, what could it do? And starting to kind of put it through its paces to figure out what were the things we could make and what just made the engine crash that
Yeah.
we'd have to pull part of that out. But it was a really basic editor. I mean, for example, there was no copy paste functionality.
Mm-hmm.
Every single thing we did was by hand. So like one of the other guys doing level design, Hutch, was trying to make kind of this interior building style area, and he was trying to make columns, and found out he had to go make every single column by hand. He couldn't like take a column and copy it and
Mm-hmm.
boom, boom, boom down the line. So he wanted ones that weren't rectangles or, going up and down. He wanted some extra facets to them. That was again just things he had to then go make by hand. And that was then one of the things I looked at and just made a strength for Guck, which is why there were so many irregular angles, is the
Right.
engine did it, or the level editor did it well. But
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we've commented on a lot, and I'm not just saying this because you're here, but Guck is, in my opinion, one of the best dungeons in a game. Period. And one of the things
thanks.
that we looked at is just there's so many little quirky, um, asymmetric elements, go along with all the great points of interest and everything else. But the lack of regularity in a lot of that design is something that I've noticed once we started building more of the levels in like Max or whatever it was that we started doing later on, probably Lucklin and beyond. And this isn't to disparage anybody's work, but as soon as we got more copy paste, everything started looking more copy paste.
Yeah.
And it lost that original charm. And we see it everywhere. We see it in just the irregularities and artifacts that you see even in a basic outdoor area like in Crushbone, right? And so I think it's amazing. There was a question in chat that about the textures. Were they captured firsthand with a camera, or was that something that was shared from Sony or purchased or just created from scratch?
I'm trying to remember how Bill did it. My guess is he probably took some reference imagery and then just made it himself.
Hmm.
It was, you got to remember, this is like 1997, 98, so we'd be busting out Photoshop and the texture resolution just couldn't be that high. There wasn't enough graphical memory. I mean, actually, side tangent, one of the riskiest decisions we made during the entire EverQuest development cycle was, are you going to need a graphics card or not for this game?
Right.
And we said yes. And so, like for early reviews, we actually had to ship graphics cards to reviewers because they weren't guaranteed to have a graphics card. And that let us put in more textures and put in animated textures. But there was a very limited texture palette that we could use for every dungeon. And that's
Hmm.
one of the reasons, for example, dungeons were themed initially by monsters. Um, for example, Guck was a froglock area because that meant I had an excuse to put hundreds of froglocks in there as opposed to having to mix a lot of different monster types because of the texture memory. And by the time you put the textures of the monsters, all of the characters, and then the environment itself, we would be maxing out the texture memory of what we could put in.
Right.
So there were only a limited amount of things we could put in each zone, just from a technical standpoint. It was just a limitation we had to work around. And so my guess is he wasn't using like any sort of go high resolution photography, take it and put it in, but more taking some things and drawing over because the texture resolution just couldn't be that high for what he could make, that the game could run.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting because there's such a community. I don't know how much you've kept up with it or sort of checked over the years or whatever, but there's such a diehard, really amazing community around EQ, and they've gone back and I think they've at this point torn everything apart. There's a wonderful project going on, Project Lantern. Am I saying it right? Lantern Project. Essentially, they've gone in and they've upres the texture so that and where they can't necessarily upres the texture, they'll recreate it from scratch and try to basically make EQ look, more beautiful but extremely original.
Yeah.
And
I've seen a little bit of that, and it's so fun to see because I remember at the time thinking everything looked really good, but that's because that's what you're used to.
mhm,
And then, over the years, one of the hardest parts for games is, graphical fidelity always, it never looks as good as you remembered unless you're doing a very highly stylized version of a
right.
game. And so it's been fun to see people kind of reimagine and trying to keep the theme the same while, being able to make it look better or the spirit of it the same.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting too because people have discovered there's a decent amount, or at least it seems like decent amount of use of public domain assets and sounds and sound packs and graphics packs and all that
Totally.
stuff back then.
Yeah, a lot of those, there was a lot of shareware and a lot of like easy licensing back then of just people who were putting things together and putting it out. And our team didn't have a huge budget. So
Right,
it doesn't surprise me at all that our artists would have been using things that were easy and cheap to get. Same with like for sound.
right.
Um, it was just, that was never like, Brad was never like, our sound is going to be the most amazing ever. It was, we're going to build this cool, huge world that you can go adventure with your friends in anytime you want to. And we'll use what sound we can get. I
Well, yeah,
mean,
decent priorities.
oh yeah. And I mean, even on reference, like I remember Rosie Cosgrove, who was our lead artist. Like I'd walk into her office and, you'd see different reference materials sitting on her desk. I think she had a Victoria's Secret sitting on her desk with Naomi Campbell on the front as she was sketching like the first female dark elf.
I was about to
Um,
say Dark Elf.
yeah. And pretty sure Naomi Campbell on a Victoria's Secret cover was one of the references for what that looked like. And it's just you'd walk in, you see different things all the time because that was what we could get.
Yeah, as
And
soon
you
as
have to
you say
remember,
Victoria's Secret, it's
yeah,
it's easy to guess what starting outfit that might have been. Interesting.
yeah. But this is also a thing to remember too that this wasn't the World Wide Web where you could go look up anything at this point with unlimited imagery.
True.
That it was just there was a lot less. Magazines were still a thing.
Hmm.
Magazines were a big thing. Like magazine covers were a big. I still have my first. Brad made a promise at one point that if we ever got a magazine cover, get a framed copy for everybody. So I actually still have sitting. Actually, here we go. Let's see. Sorry, everybody, camera's going to move for a second. There we go. You can kind of see the EverQuest cover right there. That's PC Gamer. That was the
Yeah.
first magazine cover we ever got. And we went and got a copy and he bought everybody. Though my frame broke years ago, so I got a nicer frame for it. But yeah.
Had to have been amazing. Yeah, so you mentioned spells, and we've already had a couple of questions in chat about spells, and
Yeah.
that was top of my list because of just first of all, the sheer volume of spells like you mentioned that you had to do
I'm a
is
little crazy
incredible, and I
about
want
that.
to know all about that. But then even just establishing the spell tool,
Mhm.
and let me see, one of the questions, Sitzel has a great question, which is, curious about how combat baselines were generally established via your work on spells. Did the chicken or the egg come first, or together, or something else?
So part of it was like when we started working on it, the original design document was very, very loose on what classes did.
Mm,
Like very loose on what classes did. Um, and there was like a couple of things laid out for each one. And so coming from a big D&D background, but also, a big Shadowrun is set in
mm,
Cyberpunk, and actually Champions was a really influential game for me. Champions was a superhero
mm-hmm.
system, but one of the interesting things about the Champions game is they were the first game I ever saw that divorced the mechanics from the effect, meaning that you bought powers with points, you built characters off points. So you might, for example, spend 30 points buying 6 dice of energy blast. But then you would be asked to skin it. What does your energy blast look like? Is this fire? Is this cold? Is this lightning? Do you wave your hand and an anvil appears over somebody's head and it hits them? It would always do 6 dice of damage, but the visual effect for it, and if somebody happened to have a weakness for that, was just what you'd picked.
Mm,
And so that was one of my formative games in college playing that because it really taught me about the mechanics and the systems behind the effects. And so as I was going in, starting to think about how are we designing all these classes and how will each one feel different, I used to do my work you know, during the day, and then I'd go sit in a coffee shop for hours every night, and just starting to think of what's the theme of each class based on the little bit I've been given, and then how is every single one going to be different from each other? What are they going to be good at? Because what I came in with was not every class gets everything, and every class is going to be good at a couple of things, and others might dip into that, but every class is going to have a thing that they're stand out for with overlapping roles. And so, for example, I went and I told the team that the Enchanter was going to have almost no damage, but it was going to be considered one of the most valuable classes. And nobody believed me because crowd control wasn't a thing at that point.
right.
And so I sat there for months and brainstormed on what are the types of crowd control? What can we do? Because it was a theme. There'd been some in D&D, but I wanted to take that and expand it out into a full thing that you could run. Everything from stun and root and fear and charm and mez. Like mez was a thing I kind of invented because we had a stun. And I'm like, what about a stun that you can break if you get hit?
Right.
So this is a different stun. This isn't a pile on stun. It's stun for a couple seconds, everybody pile on. This is a do a thing so that one less monster is in the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And starting to think about all the different ways that these could work. And so, yeah, I literally spent over a year in coffee shops and then talking with the team, and we'd try things out. And Roger Uzin, who did the AI, he'd have to then sit there with me and we'd start putting them in and we'd test it because we had to make the AI respond to all of this. Or we started having aggro. And then I'm like, oh, well, this is actually, it's funny. When I was making MUDs, because again, I didn't come from a programmer background, I'd go read through the source code and be like, oh, here's a switch you can flip. And so while my code in MUDs was always very mediocre at best, what I did with it made other programmers be like, how the hell did you do that? And it's because I'd take things that everybody else would and I'd like find a new creative effect for it. And so I very much came almost from a hacker mentality of, here's my tools. How do I hack this to make something interesting and something fun? Based on kind of my gaming background. Like, if you ever played Mud, did you ever play Muds in the day, or was that just
I didn't. So I played BBS games, and then I didn't really experience MUDs until I got on the EQ team, and then we were referencing,
yeah.
origins of EQ, and then it was okay, time to dabble.
And so, like, one of the things that because here's a fun one. Most people programming on MUDs were players who turned to become wizards, whizzes, which meant you could program and make zones or areas. And our editors at the time were usually in the mud. So, for example, you'd be typing, and if somebody sent you a message, or if somebody walked by and there was a thing, that line of text would appear as you were typing your code. And so it would disrupt what you were typing. And so almost every wizard ended up making their own room, like somewhere off where nobody else could walk by, so they could type their code in without constantly being spammed and like losing access to what they were doing. And so one of the basic things that actually was part of the mud code was something called shields, so that another wizard or programmer couldn't walk into your room unless you gave them permission. And I used to regularly walk into other people's rooms without permission, because I read the code and I'd be like, that's detecting players. What if I made something that just looked like a player that I could hear through them, like a microphone? And because it's text-based, they'd see something that looked like me walked in, which was actually just a microphone, but it looked like me. And because it wasn't a player, it could get through their shields. And so I could go and I'd confuse very senior programmers on the mud of how I was able to do this. And it's because I just wasn't thinking in the same way they were.
Exactly, yeah.
I didn't have the same background. I was coming from a designer hacker background. And so that was very much how I approached spell design in EverQuest. And I said with Roger for AI, and be like, okay, this is going to be too good, or how do we manage this? And be like, oh, cool, that's a lever we can manipulate. We could reset aggro to 0. We could up aggro. We could do these other things with it. We can, as I was creating the monsters, we had to put in an awareness radius. How far can a monster see you? And how close do you have to be before they'll respond or call for help? Hey, that's another variable I can manipulate with a spell. And so kind of like looking at MUDs and reading through the code, as I was reading through these, it just gave me ideas of things I could use to go make spells based on work we'd already done, because we didn't have a lot of extra programmer time to devote to this.
Right.
And so it was every lever I could find that I could throw, as well as then I'd save up to ask for things like, hey, I want something, I want an effect that breaks if they take damage. Mez. Or, and just starting to look at that. I want something when you hit them, they'll take damage. A damage shield. Even though damage shields back then and now they're called different things. And so, yeah, I've probably rattled more. What was your initial question? Sorry, this just kind of got into how we did spell design.
Yeah, I think that was the initial question. And honestly, you could just keep going and going. We'll love it. Everything you're talking about right now, I think we're kind of edge of the seat, because essentially it's insight into, it's insight into how these games work today. And especially in this one where you're using examples that we're so familiar with. There was a question in chat about expectations. Did you expect Enchant or Charm to be as powerful as it is? And it'd be cool if you could answer that. But then there are a lot of things that I'm curious if you sort of expected them to work the way they did, and what were the big ones that you're like, oh, we didn't see this coming?
Some of it's hard to know, because I felt like every time we added an extra 0 of players to our game, everything changed. So, for example, when we were testing with 10 people, we got up to 100, people just played the game differently. They'd discover a thing, word would spread, and then we got up to 1,000 and 10,000 and 100,000. Like every 0 worth of people, something new would get discovered, or there'd be some new meta that people found out working through it, because our game was so open-ended. And then we'd have to like address that and nerf and buff and do other things around it. So it's hard, because you can kind of envision how you're going to use it, but we were also a team that was very loose and seat of the pants around as we were building and designing. So, and a lot of this comes down to just the team pitching in, the balance meetings we had, Ryan's feedback, Roger, again, who did our AI, because Roger loved his monsters. Roger didn't want, people taking them out easily. And we kind of had a mandate from Brad that this was a game that was going to be so tough that you needed a group to do most of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and therefore, certain things had to be more and less powerful. Like charm was always going to be powerful. If you're bumping into a group of, say, 3 orcs, and you can take one of the orcs attacking you, stop him from attacking, and then cause him to attack something else, that is a huge shift in power.
Right.
And that's why charm was very, very limited on who got charm. Just straight up. Charm was a very powerful effect and one of the signatures of the enchanter. And that's why it would also break somewhat randomly. And there were interesting things around how it was designed to try and combat how much you could rely on it and how good it was,
But the
and
intent,
how much the monsters would hate you after.
yeah, with that one, it sounds like you had the intent and you knew the implications there. With things like question was just asked about feign splitting with the monk, and did that when was that sort of discovered? Was that early on in like beta or whatever? And like, okay, well now this is kind of defining the class, or
Partially. One of the things that, just based on how we built things, that became an acceptable style of play was that they were going to, it was always, and this will sound weird, but it was just a thing that kind of evolved out of the play, and we were like, yeah, we're good with it. Was that it was always going to be safer to kind of hit a couple things and pull them into your safe area and, kind of work your way through a dungeon that way, as opposed to kind of like the D&D game where everybody walks into a room and then you walk into the next room. And it was just part of it. Was a easier thing to do, and especially with lag spikes or clipping planes of how far you could see,
mm-hmm.
it's harder to move a group of people around, just straight up. And so gathering became very much a thing. And so certain spells that made you faster were good for that. Certain things that, like the monk being able to drop aggro, as opposed to, somebody coming in and, doing a taunt that raised the aggro above that.
Mm-hmm.
If you could drop aggro, that meant that the people who could take aggro could save doing that until later. That because everything was on the reuse timer for how often you could do it with the cooldowns. And so, it certainly wasn't the only way to do it, but it was a thing that we saw the monk doing. We'd put the ability in, like the monk being able to feign death came from, I think, D&D, from like Brad and Bill seeing that in D&D. That was a first edition monk thing. I don't even remember why monks got it in D&D. It wasn't that great in D&D, but in in a aggro management system, it was great. Hey,
Right.
you're dead. Why would the monster attack you anymore? Let's go attack something else. And so it was something that I think had just kind of gotten penciled in and that we just took and ran with. So I don't think monks had been envisioned to be initially the perfect pulling class, but through the accident of their design and then looking for, again, niches to keep every class interesting and different, it was something that got taken and run with,
Cool.
or ran with.
Yeah. And then sort of looking at how you approached items with spell effects and basically item effects, and there are a few of the more notorious or notable early items that even on TLP they'll be in for a bit and then nerfed. Can you walk us through what was going on there when you guys were doing itemization?
Yeah, so a lot of the really cool items were made by Ryan Palacio. That was more of his thing. And every once in a while, but any of the spells on them, I would make in the spell database, and then I'd say, this is spell 432, go ahead and attach it to the item.
Mm-hmm.
And testing was really hard to do because we didn't have anything that ran simulations of the game. We actually had to go in and test it live.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was literally gut checking from like Ryan, I, and a couple of other people, just our gut feel for balance. That we didn't have a lot of the tools the games have nowadays, with the big, huge spreadsheets with perfect simulations or things that could run the game with 100 encounters to see how good is the balance on this?
Right.
This was all done literally from eyeballing it and through a couple of test runs. And that's why there was so much buffing and nerfing was we didn't have the tools to do super good design analysis in the way that modern games can. And so this was all done without a lot of the mathematical aids um, that I would just consider standard nowadays for if I was making a game.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny. There's a question in chat about metrics, and it's like, well, at least
Mhm.
even when I got on the team, the amount of data that we had available to us was extremely limited. And like you
Oh
said,
yeah.
we had people that came on the team a little bit later with CS degrees and started building combat simulators and things like that. But
Mhm.
when I got there, none of that was there.
Oh, that would have been great. I mean, I would have loved it. And actually, I can tell you one of the things that we used to do, and this'll, I don't know if you guys were still doing this by the time, but we used to look at the forums and see which groups were complaining the least. And we just, that was our gauge for if they needed a nerf. That basically, we looked at the volume level of complaints, and the classes that were the quietest were generally the ones that were probably a little too powerful at that point.
Yeah, well,
Um,
it's the same thing with content. If they weren't complaining about it being just completely broken and impossible, and why would we dare do this, and we're just buying time, then the encounter probably wasn't hard enough, and we needed to go take a look.
but yeah, and as I said, in a lot of cases, it's just if that's what we do. As I said, if we'd had the tools, we would have been using them. But with such a small team and so much that we were doing, we just, man, a tools engineer would have been amazing.
Right.
I didn't even learn what really good tools engineers could do until years after EverQuest, just because we had good engineers, but they never had the time to go make, really big dev tools for all of us. I mean, even the level editor, John Blakely, yeah, it was still like up through launch was still working on the game engine and some of the tools for us. Like there were questions of would it be stable enough to launch? He did like a couple of months, well, we all did about a year of crunch, but he did even more crunch just to keep the engine, to get the stability level to where we could run it.
Mm.
I mean, it was just all these things that would be like, oh, this would have been great to have. And like, yeah, it would have been great to have, but you also build with what you got. And but to me, that was, I mean, it's interesting that I've been playing so much D&D that, that was in part of my mind, but I also was like, this is a whole different game and you build games to the format. And so like building the enchanter was a thing I'd never really seen, but it was an idea in my head. Or building bards the way they were was a thing
Mm.
that's very different than like the old D&D bards. But what was really funny was we got a little bit after EQ, year or two after EQ came out, maybe a little later, I got a tour of Wizards of the Coast with the team working on third edition D&D at the time, and we chatted with a couple of them. And their bards came out, and their bards were very much more similar to the EverQuest bards than they had been the earlier bards. And it was because all the Wizards of the Coast guys were playing EverQuest. And so we got like this little like I was influenced by them. Some of the things we did were then influenced them. And it's just this kind of synergy of creativity where you take your influences, you make your own thing out of it. Other people see that, take that, and then keep going. But crowd control really, as a concept, I think came out of EverQuest. Um, I don't think there'd ever been another game with anything quite like it until then. And
So
it's one of the things I think I'll always be happiest about was that was kind of the thing I helped introduce into gaming culture or game design, video game design around that.
yeah, I mean, it's a big one. It's an obvious one, but so much of EQ it permeates the rest of the MMOs that have come out since, and I think it's easy to sort of overlook or forget it. But when you're breaking things down and explaining it, the thought going into the classes at the time, or hey, we haven't done this before, it becomes a little bit more obvious. It's like wow, and then that's rippled out for the last 20 years. Um,
Yeah.
when you mentioned earlier, like every time you added zero, things would change. There was a question in chat that was saying, well, what what did the team kind of think the server size was going to be and the player base was going to be during that. Yeah.
Not that big. I mean, we we didn't know how popular the game was going to be when we were making it, because we kept expecting the game to be canceled. We had no advertising budget. All of the hype came from Brad sitting on the forums and telling people how great the game was going to be, and trying to find reporters or other people to come do articles about it. Literally every time we got called into a meeting up until the game launched that wasn't scheduled, we were like, oh, here's where they're going to cancel us. We did get canceled at one point. We were part of 989 Studios, and that's Sony. And Sony decided to double down on their console work, and so they canceled every single PC game. And that's why we spun out to become Variant Interactive. Was Smed and Brad went and found funding to fund the rest of the game that had been canceled. We spun off to be our own studio, and then later got acquired by another Sony Online Entertainment, years after the game had launched. But yeah, we kept expecting we were going to get canceled because this was nobody done a thing like this. They didn't know it was going to work. Even like EverQuest 2, the reason EverQuest 2 started getting worked on was that's what you did. You made a sequel because games don't run for more than a year or two. You go make number 2 and 3 and 4. We never would have worked on EQ2 if we thought EQ1 was still going to be running and popular at the time.
Right.
Just straight up. But the things you don't know.
Right. So, and when did that start? Because I think people have mentioned in the past, but I don't know the sort of year offhand. Do you know?
Let's see. EQ launched in 99. My guess is the planning started in 2001. Maybe late 2000, 2001, because it was, even the fact that we were putting out an expansion was unplanned. Like, if we'd known we were going to be putting out an expansion, for example, Kunark, we would have designed our database differently, because we were using a lot of the integers in the game. Like, the reason you went to level 50 in the game and then in Kunark only went up to 60 was we were using 64-bit integers for a lot of things. And so there wasn't a number higher we could do without redoing parts of the whole database. And so when we were like, hey, we're going to do an expansion, we were told to put 50 levels worth of content, but into 10 levels. And that's why, for example, on spells, you got new spells every single level when you did that, was because each one was representing 5 levels worth of kind of adventuring.
Right.
And that's why the alternated, the AA system came in, was we didn't have the ability to make people's levels higher without redoing part of the database. And so the whole bunch of this just came in from not actually expecting the game to still be running and making expansions even a couple of years later. It was because, again, nobody had done that at this point. This wasn't a thing you did. You went and made a sequel. And so a whole bunch of the design stuff that we had to figure out how to sneak in was us, again, kind of using that hacker mentality of, it's like, okay, hey, Jeff, we're doing another 50 levels. It's only 10 levels. We need spells past everything that you thought was the max level spell when you designed the original game.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, let's go think up all of that stuff. What can we do?
Yeah. And as Keeps mentioned in chat, there's now 27 expansions later.
Yep.
Pretty crazy. It was weird because even when I got on the team and I think this really came up as we were going into Planes of Power. It was interesting to see how many formulas and things were just not working anymore. Like Headroom had been completely devoured. And so there was a lot of gutting things behind the scenes and
a lot of tech debt, basically.
Yeah.
But it's funny, and this is a common thing. Like League of Legends, for example, which got really big really fast, spent years working on their tech debt. There were a whole bunch of characters they just couldn't design because of the way that they designed the initial things, where they had to go rewrite the entire back end of the system while keeping the game running to be able to add new things. And EverQuest was very much the same, which is just, you always hope your game is going to be popular, but you don't always necessarily know if it gets popular, what does that mean?
Right.
How do you keep running it? What extra things do you need to keep adding? Um, and yeah, it was a really good lesson for a lot of us. And that then future MMOs could look at, like when WoW came around, WoW looked at that and said, oh, this is what you do. You just keep the game running and you keep doing expansions. So they planned better for it. Not perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, but they had more of that concept going in. Just different kinds of things.
Yeah. Um, you you mentioned so in looking at your bio, the game design committee.
Mhm,
I saw that when I was researching
mhm,
on LinkedIn, and I'm really curious about what that looked like, especially
mhm.
with the folks that were there at the
Yeah.
time.
So there were different groups that worked on different things, and one of the things was there was oh is it it was yeah it was a design committee, and there were probably 8 or 10 of us on it. Let's see, I was there, Roger was there, Ryan was there, Brad was there, um, couple more. Who am I forgetting? And we used to have raging multi-hour debates about just how a thing would work, trying to theorize it out. And there were different decisions there. Like Brad was more of a fan of hardcore, and like we talked him out of some things. Like for example, Brad initially wanted. I remember there was a 2 hour debate where we talked Brad out of random hit points every time you leveled up, like in D&D. He thought that every character should get a permanent, random roll of how many hit points got added, and that was permanent. And it took, I think, Ryan and I 2 hours to talk him out of what a horrible idea that would be, because it would mean that, for example, one level 60 fighter might have 50% less hit points than another level 50 fighter, just straight up. Um, and, or things like meditate um, was just brutally long. And I think Ryan suggested the first speed up mana spell clarity. And I was like, that is a great idea. Um, I just, all these different things back and forth because Brad had a good vision, but Brad was not a systems designer.
Right.
Systems designers are the ones who think about the nuts and bolts of the balance and how the mechanics work together. He had a big idea. Other people on the team were much better at well, how do we make that work in practice?
Right.
And it's really good because he kind of knew where he wanted us to go, but he didn't necessarily know the exact best way to get us there. And so that's where we were lucky that we had some really good people who were very passionate about it and very willing to go to the mat. And one of the problems with the team was if you happened to be somebody on there who was not ready to argue for what you thought, your voice didn't get heard. And that's just part of how the team was run. But if you couldn't argue persuasively argue this needs to happen because of this, otherwise this won't work, it just didn't happen. And so a lot of the design team stuff was just rolling arguments back and forth and learning to work it out, learning to compromise. Like meditation was still way more harsh than I thought it should be, but that's part of Brad really wanted it that way. And it wasn't an argument I won. I thought it should have been a little quicker. Same with like sitting and resting and getting hit points back. His argument was always that the downtime was where you met and bonded with other people. And some of us just thought though that that's great, but it's still too long.
It's an interesting one because we talk about that one a ton these days, and
Mhm,
different elements like that, right? And
mhm,
it's been a really fun journey for me over the last year or so because I just kind of stumbled into streaming EQ as a byproduct of watching another. I popped
mhm,
in to see if anybody was playing EverQuest on Twitch. I was like, well, there's Twitch. I wonder if anybody's playing EQ.
mhm.
And one of the streamers was like, there's a new TLP server coming up. And it's really fun because it's kind of like back in the day, the newbie zones will be full and blah, blah, blah. So I asked my wife, I
Yeah.
was like, hey, do you want to
Mhm,
play EQ with me? And maybe I'll stream it. And in doing so is cool because met this community, very diehard, very fun. We started having guests on, and
mhm,
we've spent a year talking about how MMOs have changed and
Yeah.
for better or worse. And it's interesting because while I realize it's a very niche sort of crew that likes some of those decisions or some of this gameplay, it really
Mhm.
does feel like, especially as we've explored, like starting our own little indie MMO and things like that, we've explored these elements and they feel like it, they're a different game.
Mhm.
It's like MMOs didn't just evolve and this is the way they should work. They kind of hit a branch and went one way. And
Mhm.
there is this sort of downtime, social, more
Yeah.
brutal kind of game that exists out there that maybe hasn't been explored.
And that's like when, yeah, it's an interesting thing on that because one of the things that I think branched it was Blizzard. Blizzard is very, very good. They're not great at original ideas. I don't think Blizzard has almost ever put out an original game, but they're really good at finding other things and polishing them up to be a more mass market version of, things that have come before.
Hmm.
And a couple of the things that when they were making WoW, they looked at some of the stuff EQ did, and they were all big EQ players.
Right.
I know this because they actually tried to poach me out of Sony, and I went there and like walked through Blizzard, and I actually even got an offer letter for them, but didn't end up doing it, which is another story. But they were all hardcore EQ players, but they very much wanted a more mass market game. And more mass market game meant less downtime, more action.
Right.
And that was a thing they identified very early. And so, and I think with the popularity of WoW, that then set a precedent that that was the way things should be done. And so that kind of took it and ran with it. But Brad always, like when he formed Sigil, and then what's the one that he, up until he passed, was working on? I'm forgetting the name.
Pantheon at Visionary
Yeah,
Realms.
Pantheon.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was always very much every game he worked on. That was part of what he wanted. So that's built into Pantheon's DNA. Is it is a more harder, hardcore, more downtimey kind of experience,
Hmm. Yeah.
and it's just a style.
Yeah. It's one we've discussed, and I think the thought that we have is if you acknowledge that it's not going to be mass market and you can define it, all right, it's going to be a niche audience and
Mhm.
define what that means. If you can make a workable business plan out of that, then go for it.
100%. Like I was on something like a year ago, and somebody asked me, you know, if you were going to go make a new EverQuest, an EverQuest 3, what would it be like? And I said, well, we would look at what the past two had done because part of the reason you play one or two is there's a certain feel it evokes,
Mm.
but you also have to make it something that is palatable to a modern audience. And so what you have to decide is as you're designing, like every game I've ever worked on, part of what you do is you have to identify who's going to play the game, what's the audience, and are you making the game that is right for your audience?
Right.
And so, for example, if you're looking for a more hardcore niche game, you have to identify the audience and figure out what are you making that really fills the desire for that audience. And you can make games that support niche all the way up to mainstream, and they're different kinds of games.
Hmm. Yeah.
Though
So
sometimes they're more popular than you think. You look at a game like Dark Souls and you realize that there is an appetite for harder games.
yeah, honestly, one of the things that had me thinking about EQ last year when I checked in when I did was I had bounced from Overwatch to playing a lot more Escape from Tarkov, and
Mm.
playing Tarkov got me thinking, wow, this is brutal and painful at times, but so rewarding when I actually don't get like one shotted. I wonder what's going on
Yeah.
with EverQuest. It was just a natural sort of like flow of
Random
thought.
hill giant walking through the Karanas, stepping on you, kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Um, there's a question in chat that I want to make sure I don't miss.
Yeah.
That
Is it the slash pizza one?
No, not the slash pizza one. The what
Try to
is a
keep it up.
mechanic that sounded simple to implement but found
Oh,
it difficult once you attempted it?
there were a couple of things. Like one of the things in early EverQuest, we'd wanted to do trade skills, but nobody was doing them, and so they just kept getting pushed off. And Matt Yaney joined the team and just got handed trade skills. And the problem was we'd never really factored them into the balance of the rest of the game. And so it was like, oh yeah, go make a trade skill system.
Mm.
But a good trade skill system should integrate with the game to be essential to kind of all parts of play. And the initial one just wasn't, because it was put in as an afterthought. And it was put in as an afterthought because Ultima Online had one. And Brad and Bill felt that we needed that as a bullet point to make interesting. That had to be a thing our game had as well. But when Raph and his team were doing Ultima, trade skills were like a core part, crafting, and everything was a core part of the game, where it wasn't for ours. So that was something that I think some of the members of the team were like, oh yeah, we'll just put one in, without thinking of how much that really needed to tie in with the entirety of the game. Let's see, that's one example. For me, it's interesting. I didn't have as many. Like, I had my cheat sheets of everything I'd worked out mentally. Like, how much more damage did wizards do on the mana to damage ratio? Or, who got this or who got this, or what was this kind of like. I had my cheat sheets of all of this where I just worked on the tuning over time. So I always had a good reference for that. And I said, I'm a systems designer. I look at a thing and I take it apart until I understand it, and then I put it together and I make it work. So there are things that were complex, but it was never one that was like, oh, this is a lot harder. Probably actually, no, let me take that back. The overall balance, we had so many moving pieces, 14 classes, 700 spells, thousands of items, thousands of monsters, different race class combinations, almost no documentation for the players. Like, trying to balance the game out to make it super smooth was, I think, the single hardest thing that we wanted to get right, that we never got perfect because we just didn't have the tools to be able to do it. And it was something, Brad was like, oh yeah, just balance that. And we'd be like, we're trying. But
Yeah.
actually, that's not really fair to say. Like, Brad would say balance that, but he was in there playing the game as well. Like, and it was, part of it was just, it was hard. We also were like, we never built tools to tell players what was going on. And that's why, like, Greg putting up Caster's Realm, one of the biggest things for that was he played an enchanter. And he didn't quite understand how the spells worked. And so he put together a scraper that would scrape the information off of the game install, that he could then take and export up, that he could look at. And he later turned that into a database that he could put online of, here's every spell in the game with a translation of what it does. That's
Mm-hmm.
what made his whole website popular. And so theoretically, we should have built something like that into the game ourselves. We just never had the time, or it was never prioritized. Like, that's a thing that should have been prioritized, more information about the game. But it's, again, small team, too much to do.
Yeah, and it's fun. We've talked about that as well, in that maybe this is wrong-headed, but I kind of feel like the fact that that information wasn't there created a really cool external community, which then
Yep.
it drove. There's a difference in psychology there, and given your background, I don't want to like overstep or whatever. I don't know what I'm talking about, but like it's it created, I think, a different feeling community from the onset, and honestly, it provided some really interesting opportunities for people like Greg and
Oh yeah.
others. So,
Mm.
but
So I saw one in there I want to grab. What was the rationale of caster pet summoning lower than
yeah,
the spell level? So one of the hard things in EQ was that, an even level monster didn't mean you could defeat it solo necessarily, or it did, but that might deplete all of your resources, which is why you teamed up with a group. And so this was just a debate that, again, kind of raged back and forth on the team, was how powerful should pets be? Because if you have a pet that, say, is even level to you, that means that the one spell you cast should theoretically be able to take out an equal level monster with one depletion of resources, your one spell, versus something that should take a group to do.
Mm.
And so, kind of over time, monsters or pets were always a little less powerful than the monster you were fighting because, again, it wasn't meant to be a this one thing can solo an encounter uh, kind of thing. It was just straight a balance kind of thing. But different classes got more powerful pets. Like the mage and the necromancer were always the two primary pet classes. Their pets were always slightly more powerful than every other group's pets.
Mm-hmm.
And the mage also got, the ability to summon different styles of pets with the four elementals.
Right.
And trying to figure out how to make them all somewhat useful in different situations was always a fun thing. Because there were different pets. If you had a whole bunch of tanks, you would summon a different pet than if you had a group with very few tanks. Or or if you wanted. Yeah, there was a lot of fun things around that. Where the necromancer, it was a drain tank in some cases with his ability to life tap, funnel some of his life back into other things, like say a pet or a companion. And it's just, yeah, different ways of doing it.
And so when you look at the lessons that were learned from basically putting all that in, having it sort of make contact with the enemy, and then add a zero and more zeros and more zeros, and kind of tweak and tune the evolution of the raid game by Kunark.
Mm-hmm.
How did that shape your thoughts going into EQ2?
So one of the things that came for actually, let me ask one more question. This came up in chat,
Sure.
and then
Yeah,
get to that.
always.
Somebody asked if I ever thought of a healing pet. Healing pet was thought of, but we were worried that what that would do to aggro, because healing attracted a lot of aggro, and having something that you couldn't control when the healing happened would have had would have played merry havoc with the aggro system on possibly directing it to the pet, making it too good of a tank, which would there's a whole bunch of stuff around there that you start thinking about what would happen if you had a pet that could heal and just did so indiscriminately. And you end up, if you run that thought experiment, you end up in some very interesting places. And so that's why there never ended up being healing pets in EQ, at least when I was working on it.
Makes sense.
Because think about how healers wait and then cast at certain times or between. I mean, when you cast your heal is a very important thing. People who just dump heals or spam heals tend to die pretty quickly, and they only do it when it's a oh crap situation. So yeah, there was some thought around there, and I couldn't figure out a way that I would have been happy with the initial implementation.
Mm-hmm.
So we just didn't end up doing it.
Fair enough.
But it was the thing I thought about.
So
EQ2. So one of the interesting things is some of the lessons there. One of the things that always was a really hard thing is parties had a maximum count of 6, but there were 14 classes. And there's also a perception, and in some cases warranted, where in some cases not, that some classes are better than others at certain things. And so, for example, you might say, my group always needs crowd control. We always need an enchanter. Okay, now there's 5 slots left in your party on 13 classes. Or you might say clerics, I think, are the best healers, so we always need a cleric. Okay, so now again, 5 slots left in a party, 13 other classes. And so you start thinking about how this works. And so one of the concepts in EQ2 going in that I helped pioneer, but then left because I went off to Sovereign, so I never really worked on the implementation. But one of the concepts had been that there were 4 big classes, and that, for example, if you were playing a cleric, you were going to pick a cleric, and later you would pick a subclass of cleric, and that might be a druid or a shaman, or or the kind of more cleric line, and that they would branch and then branch again going down. But the core concept was that if you needed a cleric, any cleric would do. Meaning it didn't matter if they were a shaman, druid, a cleric, whatever. that this person would fulfill the role in the party. And it didn't get implemented perfectly. But that was kind of the course concept that, if you needed a mage, any mage would do. And your mage would then pick specializations as they went down, but they would all fulfill the same need in there. And that got tricky because, for example, if you look at the mage classes in EQ1, enchanters did very different things than magicians, who did very different things than wizards.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just damage. It was, the wizard was very good at direct damage. The enchanter was very good at crowd control. The mage was very good at pets and basically sustained damage over time. And so those are all very different roles that can be filled. But again, one of the thoughts had been that if you needed a cleric, any cleric would do. If you needed a fighter, any fighter would do, kind of thing. Then that therefore, if we still had 6 slots in a party, you could grab one, that it was much easier to always find a party because you're like, yeah, I'm a druid, but that's still a cleric. You need a cleric in your party, I'm fine, kind of thing. And so that was one of the core thoughts that came out of EQ1 based on so many different classes, but a limited party size.
And was that so that concept of kind of starting chunky and then getting more specialized as you go, was that just a general team? The team was behind that? Was that Bill or?
No, the team was behind that. And that came out. We had like 8 or 10 offsites for a whole bunch of the EQ members and a whole bunch of people who are going to be working on EQ2. Maybe not 8 or 10. A goodly number of offsites where we just bantered around some of these big ideas. And that was one of the ones that came off of one of the offsites of bantering through the big ideas. That was one of the big ideas that the group came up with.
Right. And
I don't remember if that was in particularly, it was just a thing that we'd all kind of seen over time and wanted to address. And I don't know if that was the right answer, but that was our solution as a group to the my class isn't, my class doesn't want it in a party, I feel useless kind of thing.
right, and then it was also, it was more questy. And I know at the time, like when I got on the team, it was always kind of the joke of how few quests there were in EverQuest.
Mm-hmm.
And then EQ2, it just felt like it was very much quest after quest after
The
quest.
opposite, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was another one. We didn't have a great quest tool in EverQuest 1. Tony Garcia, I think, probably did more than half of the quests. One guy, like Tony's full-time job was sitting there making quests all day, every day. That was what Tony did. He did a couple other things, but it was Tony made quests. But we didn't have the exclamation point over somebody's head, so you didn't know the guy had it. You had to look at the dialogue they said and ask them a thing. It was almost more like some of the old Zork days where we look for catchphrases. You said a thing that got caught by the NPC, which would trigger another line of dialogue. There was no quest journal initially to say what quest you were on or what you needed. So our tool support for quests was really, really poor. And that is a thing that got brought up for EQ2 is that we needed, if EverQuest, you're always on a quest, we needed better support for quests. And that might have gone a little too extreme the other way. But I think in some cases, there's a lot more quests in EQ than people know about or regularly see, but it's because they're so hard to spot.
Right.
It makes them very hard to know how many there are or participate in all of them.
Yeah, it wound up being a bullet for marketing on the back of the box later on
Yeah,
when we were on there. They were like, "Well, how many quests?" And we'd have to pull some out of the
right.
database, and it's 1,000 quests. And once you subdivide that across classes and blah blah blah, yeah, it's uh,
Mhm.
um, yeah. So while it's up there, Nick just asked a question about Sovereign, and Sovereign's something that it's funny because I've worked with a number of people that came from that team. Over time, I think once Sovereign was shut down, a lot of folks moved back onto EQ. But Nick's
Yep.
question was, what was Sovereign all about? What did you guys envision was the gameplay loop of an MMORTS? How did it differ
Yeah.
from normal RTS games like Warcraft, Starcraft, etc.?
So when I got tapped to go onto the Sovereign team, there were no other designers on it. Clint Worley was the producer. Um, Bart, what was Bart's last name? Was the lead engineer. And they had a couple of ideas, but Smed had given them an idea. Smed said, I want an RTS that's an MMO that, plays over the course of months as opposed to hours and minutes.
Mhm.
That was the concept they got given. And so they were planning some stuff out, and Bart made this amazing engine that you could see a planet and you could pull out to orbit and zoom back in to like look at a guy holding his gun. And they were on globes. And this was really cool, but it didn't play particularly well for actiony kind of gameplay. And this was before, there's other games now that play kind of like that over months at a time. But when I came on, literally there had not been a designer on the game yet. They'd taken Brad's concept, they'd spent over a year making this technology and some units. They had a cool lead artist, Russ. And I looked at it, I said, where's the game? And John said, well, go figure it out. And so I think we went through 7 iterations of the design because I came up with one. And he's like, that's cool, but what about these things? I'm like, oh, you didn't say we needed that. And then went back to the drawing board and started working some of those in. And we slowly started evolving it to, and we came up with these problems. Like, what happens if you've been building a city for 2 months and then somebody comes in and attacks the city while you're offline? What if you're gone for 12 hours and you come back and your city's crashed? How do you make it interesting to play for really long periods of time? And even like some of the classes, actually, one of my favorite design decisions I ever made was I think there were 6 classes coming in. It was like soldier and diplomat and spy and theologian and propagandist. And they were looking initially like, how are we going to balance it when the soldiers' units always are going to be better? That's what they're good at. They're good at the war part. And so I killed the soldier class. And then suddenly we had everybody's units were about as powerful, but it was the other thing. It was, were you good at espionage? Were you good at propaganda? Were your troops loyal because of theology? And kind of looking at how we made it an interesting long-term diplomacy kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, I, through design, changed pretty much the entire course of it, where you had a persistence between things, but your games weren't expected to be kind of this game lasts for 3 months at a time. It was, and we shifted it to a far future thing. You had this kind of huge mothership that you would fly from planet to planet looking for resources. And there were these aliens on them that were constantly kind of pushing in. And so you'd do drops with your troops and hundreds of other players at the same time for kind of this Starship Troopers, like thousands of units landing on a planet to go push back the aliens and grab what resources you could, stand up bases and see if you could hold territory. And if you could hold it, you could then leave with it, like stuff mining and gathering things for you long term to upgrade your mothership for better resources, better troops, better things you could bring to your next deployments. And you could kind of go and colonize more planets. So you have to go back and defend your old things. And guilds could take, ownership of planets, but they'd have to defend them against waves of aliens coming in. So it became like everything from 20 to 2-hour long, like intense combat sessions that you'd then pull out of with how much could you take with you to kind of go on to the next thing and kind of keep doing upgrades for better and better troops. But it wasn't a thing where if you went on vacation for 2 days, you'd come back and the city you'd spent 3 months building was trashed because some guy'd come in and rolled through it. And right around as we'd kind of gotten to that point, EQ2 was late and Star Wars Galaxies was late. And so Sovereign, being the riskiest game at that point, got canceled, and the people got pulled on that to go work on those other 2 games because of the Star Wars license. We couldn't afford for it to be late.
Yeah.
And EverQuest 2 was a flagship title. And so John made the right business decision, which was, this is the highest risk game. We're short on resources as a company. We need to, spend our resources on something less risky and that we're contractually obliged to in the case of Star Wars.
Right.
So that was the right, it was a little disappointing because we'd kind of finally figured out how to make this a really interesting thing. But that was that.
It's crazy because as you're describing it, I've known of Sovereign since I was there, and like I said, worked with some of the people that then got pulled off the team and came back to EQ during that period, etc.
Mm.
I've always considered it like, all right, so how are they going to approach MMORTS? And I always pictured a PvP. And when you
Mhm.
describe something that's more PvE centric, and you've got like these massive battles that could go on for quite a while, but when you've got multiple people, then you've got other people taking over and maybe shared coordination of resources and all.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that actually sounded like that would have been pretty damn cool and ahead of the curve. It's really a shame, but I do remember the period you're describing in terms of stuff being late.
Yeah. And again, it took us a whole bunch of iterations to get to that point
Mm,
because that wasn't kind of the most obvious one, but it was one that I still haven't seen anything quite like it. I think a game like that could quite possibly still do well.
absolutely.
And we planned some PvP like guild versus guild elements in it, but it was always envisioned to be more of a PvP, or excuse me, PvE RTS because it was going to be easier on playstyle to do, and we just honestly thought more engaging.
Yeah, no, it sounds fantastic. Hopefully Nick is writing notes for game number 3 for us. One of these years we'll have to try that out. Um,
Yeah.
the some of the questions that
Well, if
came
you
in.
ever do that one, you got to poke me so we can
Absolutely
chat.
will. I 1000% will. Yeah, so it's interesting. I was looking at some of my notes and thinking about Kunark as we had jumped over, and there's some questions in there, or at least a comment, and it triggered. Uh, let's see how to form this question. During that period, like classic EQ and then Kunark, it
Mhm.
felt like there were decisions driven less off like, is this perfectly balanced, or have we considered the implications of the addition of this item or quest or whatever, and more of just like, wow, this seems really cool.
There was a lot of this seems cool. Yeah.
And it's so charming though. There's something about that. And the question I have is, do you think there's a way to make something that is durable and has longevity, but also has that sort of random charm, and it feels like people just did shit they thought was cool?
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually, it's still playing, for example, through Fallout 4, probably
Mm,
the longest single game I've ever played with. There's definitely people at Oblivion who threw stuff in because they're like, ah, this is just friggin' cool. You know, that no sane team would have done some of the things they did, but they put it in because it was cool. I saw a little bit of that on the Final Fantasy VII remake. I mean, I think th- I think a team that has a playful spirit and a creative director or lead designer willing to just say, "Yeah, go for it," can go a really long way
mm,
to that. And some of that's hard though. Um, I mean, big AAA and S tier games at this point are, 60, 70, 80, $120 million games. Call of Duty costs $100 million plus for every Call of Duty that comes out. They take 3 years to make, so Activision has three teams making them, staggered.
mm.
So, and there's probably 1,000 people per team when you look at it. It's hard to get super creative and playful on a 1,000 person team with a strict deadline of it's like this has to happen here, this has to happen here, or a game like a Madden that has to come out every single year. Um, it's just certain teams and certain games lend themselves more to it or less. Where you get something like Bethesda working on Fallout, like it's gonna come out at some point. You can put more quirky stuff in, or like Cyberpunk. Though much maligned, ran. Their dev team ran forever. Some of their side quests are some of the most fun parts of the game. So just kind of the quirky stuff that designers put in. So there's a lot. I think that there's a lot that still goes on. It just depends on the team and the structure of the team and what you're making.
And it's interesting that um, so much of that shown through. We had Jeff Butler here pretty recently, a
Yeah.
couple weeks ago, and he was just talking about. Well, he mentioned a couple things. One, he was talking about how, as you said, you guys crunched for a year, and how crispy folks got. And then, as part of that, he paid you a huge compliment. It's one that I've seen repeated from a number of folks. He was just like, stated you had like the best disposition. We're always just kind of fun, tended to be joking around and happy, despite how brutal that was. Can you give us some insight into that period leading up to launch?
Yeah, it was. So crunch is always a rough thing, but I feel like the crunch for EQ was brutal, but it was also, we were a small team working on a thing that we thought was really friggin' cool. And so we overscoped what we should have done, just straight up. Like sometimes crunch comes down from management, and it did from this case, but it also came in because we were like, and I want to build 750 spells into this. Well, that's going to take a lot of time. That was, I could have come in with a 200 spell slot system, and that would have been significantly faster and easier to balance in other things, less time. We could have launched with less zones. We could have had less items. We could have had less, there was a lot of the stuff that we just put in because we were young and stupid and really enjoyed what we were working on. But yeah, there was a period where it was just, I think it was 12-hour days, 6 days a week. It was just, we had a lot to do and not enough people to do it and no money to go hire more people.
Mm.
So that was what we did. And crunch has always been part of the game industry. And it's funny, I was lucky. We crunched on that game and it turned out well. I know lots of people who have crunched like that on things that have then been canceled or turned out poorly. And we got lucky in that we crunched for a thing that ended up being a thing people still remember 2 decades later.
Right.
But that's also why I still can't eat Papa John's pizza. Is just, we ordered Papa John's pizza, I think, every night for dinner for like a year. And there are certain things you just get burned out and give you like, you look at it and it just brings back like memories. You're like, oh man, I'm going to get indigestion not because I don't like pizza, but because I ate that every single night for a year. And just, yeah.
Oh yeah.
But I think, to tell you how burned out I was on that, when the day the game went live, we'd thrown a big like shutting down this beta servers thing. We were in, and we'd already sent the game off for the gold master, but we knew there was going to be a patch. We were a day one patch game, which was again very unusual for the time. But we're there, the servers were going up, and somebody, I don't remember who, found that there was an office-wide PA system that we'd never used before, like or tied in through all the phones, it could like make all the phones do speaker. So we're all sitting there working, and we're just tired, and suddenly, like from all over, we just hear, the game is live, and I hallucinated. I didn't hear that. Do you remember the scene in The Empire Strikes Back where they're on Hoth and they're sending the shuttles out past the Star Destroyers that are blockading coming in, and they're shooting with the ion cannon, and the first one gets through and you hear, the first shuttle's away, and everybody in the hangar's like, yay! I heard the game is live, and I could have sworn they're like, the first shuttle's away, because everybody's like, yay! And then we all went back to work. And we were just literally like things like that, where like I remember launching. I remember going with Brad and Ryan and a couple other people to the GameStop at UTC, University Town Center, to go buy a physical copy of the game just because we wanted to go see our game in the store. And seeing a couple other people like walking away with it, EQ box in their bag and being like, somebody else bought our game. That's amazing. I remember doing a signing there. I remember the game almost stopping because we'd booked internet from UUNet, which was a major backbone provider. We said, we're going to need this much internet to run our game. And they said, oh, you're going to burst up to this much internet. And we said, no, we're going to need this much internet bandwidth constantly. And they said, sure, whatever. And they sold it to us. But they oversold their capacity because they didn't think we were actually going to use as much as we said we were going to use. So like for the first couple of weeks when we went on, we filled up the bandwidth the pipe going from San Diego to LA, because the backbone of the internet at the time, San Diego to LA, from which it distributed.
Mm.
So we were, for example, knocking Qualcomm's global positioning satellites out because they were also in the same backbone going up. Some of the other, Sony things. And so, like, the game kept knocking players offline because there was no more bandwidth leaving San Diego because we were filling it up and Unet had oversold. So I believe like that evening they were like, "Holy beep!" And they like started a trenching machine going from LA to San Diego to lay more pipe, like that evening without even getting permits. They'd been planning to do it, but not yet, just because they were so in breach of contract. And it wasn't just us and our, calling them up. It was Qualcomm and other groups too. But yeah, there was just a whole bunch of stuff around that that was just like, that was one we hadn't counted on as game designers, that there wouldn't be enough bandwidth leaving San Diego.
Yeah, so I've heard part of that story, but it's funny the additional details. It's fantastic. It's weird because it was very much a moment of companies like that now realize, all right, the future's here, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I had that experience when I installed and basically logged in for the first time,
Mm.
was sitting in the newbie yard in Kanos. It started storming and I was like, what? There's weather. The day night
Oh
cycle is
yeah.
going. I'm like, what? This is a place. And then there's people running around and, different races. And I'm yelling for my girlfriend at the time. I was like, those are people. And at that
Mm.
moment, I realized, like, all
Mm.
right, everything that I've read about, all the William Gibson novels, all of the
Oh
nerdy
yeah.
cyberpunk stuff as a kid, it's happening right now and it's about to get super weird. And
Yep.
so it was just there. I was like, this is now happening. I have to move to California and be a part of this. When when did that sort of sink in for you?
It took a little while. I mean, we'd always hoped it would, but like seeing the initial number of people playing and looking at our big board, like the big screen of all the different servers and how many people were on, and having to go stand up more and more servers really quickly. Um, and going to like my first GDC after that, I think I was sitting in the lobby with a couple of EQ team members. We were sitting next to guys who made Rainbow Six. We'd been playing Rainbow Six, and we're like, "Oh man, you guys made Rainbow Six!" And like, "Holy, you guys made EverQuest!" We're like, "Wait," and it was just like that for the whole thing. Like all GDC was talking about EverQuest, and like, yeah, it was interesting. And I got really lucky in that I'm a forward-facing game designer. I'm a game designer that not all game designers will necessarily go talk and give a good interview and not
Mm.
embarrass me. And so I got to do a lot of interviews and a lot of press and go to a lot of things because I was somebody that Brad and Smed were like, Jeff will talk well. Jeff will not embarrass us. Jeff will not say stupid things. Jeff will not get drunk and end up, passed out at a bar somewhere. Jeff is okay to go do this. And so I I got to go talk and do a whole bunch of this. And it was like, wow, I got to go along for the ride, which was a ton of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, that was a bit of shame on my face. Thank you, chat. I got to
Mhm.
be sent out a good bit once my time was on the team, but yeah, I probably could have calmed down on some of the drinking at times.
Oh, we were all young and silly. I mean, that's what we did.
Yeah. So it's you mentioned sort of some of the. It's funny because you mentioned being forward facing, and then I kind of heard
Can you give me
unsung.
20 seconds? I'm sorry, my toddler's waking up. I want to shut the door so we don't hear angry
Oh
toddler
yeah,
in the
no problem,
background.
no problem.
One sec.
Reminds me of me with the toddler. Yeah, Ali. If we could bottle the amount of energy that your son has, that would the game would be done and out next week. Yeah, so you guys, while we have a moment, think Think about anything that you've forgotten to ask so far. We're at the or it's 8:37 here, so we're at the hour and a half mark. I know it sounded like we have him for about an hour and a half. With toddler timing, we may be hitting sort of the end of it. So definitely, who made taunts? You need their name. Yeah, so while you're away, I was looking at the time as well, and so we've gone over the hour and a half mark, and that's fine for me, but I definitely want to make sure that we don't keep
Yeah.
you too long. So I was
I gotta
asking
go grab a
folks,
kid in a couple minutes, but,
yeah,
yeah, I'm happy to grab another question or 2 or just call it here, and if you ever wanna talk more about it, I'm always happy to hop back on.
that'd be fantastic. That's one of those things too that after the fact, I know we have a tendency to think of questions that we would have asked or wanted to ask and forgot about or whatever. So I'll definitely follow up with you. Let me see if there's
Oh,
anything
Tom's a good
stands
story,
out.
yeah.
Hmm?
I was just looking at who made Taunt. Taunt actually, I think, came in from one of the mods that Brad and, Ryan played together, but it was part of the aggro management system, and, manipulating it. But, yeah, we could talk a whole thing about aggro management.
Cool. So I tell you what we'll do then is because we have a whole bunch of your a ton of
Mhm.
your career beyond this as well that'd be fun to dig into. And so
Mm.
let's look at, especially with the taller waking up, let's look at hitting pause here, and I'll follow up with you on setting up another
Yep.
one and see kind of what you
Okay.
thought about this. And it sounds like you're willing to come back, so that's pretty badass.
Sure.
And then we'll gather up some more questions in the meantime, especially given your history with the spell system and knowing like the details, systems details. We have so many questions that have come up over the last year that I wish I had them all in front of me, but yeah,
Well, we'll do it next time. By the
cool.
way, if you can see right here, that's still the original lithograph from, EverQuest, from, like, the first print run. I've always kept one. That's the, full Parkinson cover.
Amazing. It's such good art. It's
Oh, he was an amazing artist.
fantastic. Yeah,
Actually,
people
that's one for next time. Want me to tell you some Parkinson stories?
absolutely. That would be great. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody in chat, and, passing along the love.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'll
Mhm.
follow up. This has been fantastic and definitely appreciate the time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Catch y'all later.
See you.
Mm.
And